Scott Morrison has failed to explain away why he felt the need to appoint himself to several ministries during the pandemic. In his press conference yesterday, he was evasive at best and hostile at worst, when the fact is everything he did flew in the face of convention. But hey, it was the pandemic, right? That seems to be an excuse for everything that was done during that period. Makes you wonder how many other decisions have been made in the name of public health that we've never heard about. Joining me now to discuss this is Liberal Senator Alex Antic. Alex, it's great to see you. How are you?
I'm really well, thanks, Rowan. And you're well, I take it?
Absolutely. Now, Alex, you're one of the voices of sanity in the Liberal Party. Firstly, what do you make of Morrison's ministries?
Oh, look, Ron, I don't really know what to make of it in total. I mean, I was a bit stunned by this news myself. I was a bit disappointed, I have to say. I would have liked to have known about these things, as I'm sure the party room would have. I think you hit the nail on the head, though, there, that something that's been dear to my heart over the last period is the extent to which this concept of emergency is now being used to wrench powers away from people. And it's not just in this instance, of course, but it's just another example of this being a shield for that sort of a tactic, I suppose. But also, we've seen this all across the country, all across the world, the Western world, in the last couple of years, where we're told that things are so dire and so desperate and such an emergency that we need to dispense with convention. Hundreds of years of Westminster tradition just go out the window because of this concept of the emergency. We're going to see it with the climate now. We're going to see climate lockdowns, I'm sure, people using an app to make sure they don't buy too many steaks and they get their quota of bugs and all that sort of stuff. So, look, I think this ties into that narrative a little bit. I'm perplexed by this. We certainly don't want to throw Scott under the bus by any means, but I think we all would have liked to have known.
Well, it seems to be just the perfect metaphor, Alex, for everything, the abuse of power and everything else that went wrong, the overreach, the authoritarianism. As you said, centuries of Westminster Convention. The point of governments is that they are supposed to behave according to the rules even when the going gets tough. We never saw this sort of behaviour during World Wars, for example. So governments should stick to the rules, their own rules, even when there are difficult times. Why haven't we seen, Alex, the same anger that's being directed at Scott Morrison? I mean, he's at the top of the pyramid. But I would argue, and this is why we need a royal commission into what occurred in COVID, why aren't we seeing the same anger directed at those premiers and those chief health officers who we now know clearly went too far in many of their regulations?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. I mean, really, the aim should be taken more, I think, at the states generally across Australia. I mean, they were the ones that held most of the rope on this. They were the ones that controlled all the public health powers and all of the policing powers and all the things that were used and abused during the last 2 years in order to lock people in their homes, in order to shut down businesses and destroy lives. So, look, I agree. I think, once again, Scott has been a lightning rod for vitriol for too long. It isn't fair all the way along. I mean, we've seen Prime Minister Albanese getting away with the sorts of things that in the public square Scott Morrison would have been hung, drawn and quartered for. So, look, that is just one of the strange, unique things about the way in which the media have treated him unfairly, I would say, even though, as I said, I don't like what we saw in the last couple of days with that excess ministry stuff. But look, this is the question. There is so much to dig into. We have to make sure one way or another, and I'm with you, I am entirely in support of a royal commission. I think it's an absolute necessity. We have seen things happen in this country that I never thought I would see happen. People being forced into medical treatments, backflips from chief health officers. Now we're seeing that we're being told now, actually, transmission is not an issue when it comes to vaccination. Yeah, we know that. We were telling you that 12 months ago, by the way. And now all of a sudden people are going to wriggle out of this? Well, no, that's not where I sit. I think we need to have a full, and I hate this expression, so forgive me, deep dive into this ASAP, and a royal commission, a broad-based royal commission, is absolutely the answer.
Well, you mentioned the backflip not only of various chief health officers, but the backflip by the Center for Diseases Control in the US. They were basically the mob who set the template around the Western world for how to behave, lockdowns, masks, etc. They've now backflipped and said, oh, we've now decided that you can treat the unvaccinated exactly the same as the vaccinated. Thereby, the logic of that is that all that demonising we saw from Gladys Berejiklian Dan Andrews above all, but also many others, people in politics, corporations, demonising the unvaccinated, treating them as dirty and filthy and lepers. All of that was unnecessary. And all the people who lost their jobs, and I've had been in touch with many of them who have contacted me, lost their jobs, lost their businesses, lost their livelihood. Some even have to leave this country simply because the unvaccinated were being demonised. How do we ever repay them? I mean, they don't really care if Morrison was the minister for this, that, or whatever else. He could have been the minister for lollipops. It doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is their lives were destroyed by government overreach, Alex.
Yeah, spot on, Rowan. You've taken all of the words right out of my mouth. I mean, it's exactly the point. It's a question here of how much we want government to rule our lives. In the last 2 years, we've seen the ugly end of what that looks like, particularly when you get parliaments all across the country taking big blocks of power and giving it to unelected bureaucrats to do with as they will. We've seen what happens. I mean, we're getting into this sort of illiberal, awful, swamp-like, response to public health. Or once again, based on the fact that we're looking at an emergency, a health emergency, people have suffered. And look, I mean, I can almost hear the ringing out there. Well, it's only X number of people. It doesn't matter. People have suffered through this period. Corporations need to reinstate people. Public health orders need to drop. We now know that the whole premise was built on a lie, and it's time for people to have that mea culpa moment. It's time for them all to apologise, and it's time for us to find out how we make sure this never happens again.
Well, Alex, you were one of the very few in our parliament, and you can hold your head high over the last couple of years, you and a handful of others who fought against and spoke out against this madness. Now, just briefly before we go, you mentioned climate and the climate emergency. We're that far away, I'm sure, from the Labor Party of Chris Bowen and Anthony Albanese declaring some kind of climate emergency as justification for heaven knows what kind of overreach and authoritarianism. Why aren't the Liberals coming out strongly and opposing, for example, 43%, etc., net zero, so on and so forth? Where is the pushback against the climate abuses of power that I'm sure we're going to see?
Well, of course, we would be remiss of me not to point out that we have opposed the climate change bill, and I certainly won't be supporting that. I'm concerned by that piece of legislation on a whole range of issues, not the least of which being that target can now be raised with the sweep of a pen without coming back to Parliament. So you can expect that target to increase under a Albanese-Bowen government for sure. Look, I think we need to. I've said it for the longest time. I think the point of difference for the Liberal Party has to be being the Liberal Party. We saw what happened at the last elections, state and here in South Australia and federally as well, when we pander to this teal voice. And we need to come out strongly. I was very encouraged to see Peter Dutton talking about nuclear power. That's a good step. But ultimately, we've got to get sensible. The coral in the reef is growing, Rowan. There is no climate emergency. We've got to say it and say it proud. We've got to win that argument because we've kowtowed on it for too long.
Fantastic. Well, Alex Antic, always great to see you and to speak to you, and keep up the fight. So many Australians are 100% behind you, mate. Thanks so much, Senator Alex Antic.
Thanks, Ron.